Right now, there's a slab of glass in your pocket. It weighs about as much as a candy bar, and it can reach almost any person on Earth in under a second. 70 years ago, doing what that slab does would have filled the trunk of a car, cost more than the car itself, and still only let a few dozen people in an entire city talk at the same time. This is the story of how that machine in the trunk became the one in your hand. And before we start, one question. Why is it called a cell phone? Not a pocket phone, not a radio phone, a cell phone. Take a guess right now. Drop it in the comments. And in about a minute, you'll find out if you were right. It begins in 1946. In St. Louis, a driver picks up a heavy handset bolted to his dashboard and for the first time makes a telephone call from a moving car. No wires. It feels like magic. But there's a catch. To place the call, he has to talk to a human operator who plugs him through by hand. Only one person can speak at a time on each channel, and the whole city has just 3 channels. 3 for everyone. One giant antenna on a tower downtown blasted the signal across the entire city, and that single tower could only handle a handful of calls at once. The waiting list to even get a car phone ran for years. The airwaves were full. And here's the strange part. The radio spectrum is like a set of lanes on a highway, and there were only so many lanes. Every extra caller needed their own lane, and the city ran out almost immediately. For 20 years, this problem looked unsolvable. Then, engineers at Bell Labs had an idea that sounds almost too simple. Instead of one enormous tower shouting across the whole city, what if you covered the city with dozens of small, weak towers? Each one would light up only a tiny zone, maybe a mile or 2 across. They drew those zones as a grid of hexagons on a map, and they had a name for each little hexagon of coverage. They called it a cell. That's the answer. If you guessed the phone is named after those honeycomb zones on a map, you were right. Your phone is a cell phone because the world is quietly divided into invisible cells, and you are always standing inside one. Here's why the cells were genius. Because each tower was weak, its signal died out before it reached the next cell over. So 2 towers a few miles apart could reuse the exact same channel without ever interfering. Suddenly, the same 3 lanes could carry thousands of calls across a city at once. The spectrum problem was solved by making the towers smaller, not bigger. But every solution breeds a new problem. If each tower only covers a mile, what happens when you drive out of one cell and into the next in the middle of a sentence? The answer is a piece of invisible choreography called the handoff. As you move, the network watches your signal fade at one tower and rise at the next, and in a fraction of a second, it passes your live call from tower to tower without you ever hearing a click. To do that automatically, for thousands of moving cars at once, you needed computers fast enough to decide in milliseconds. Those computers didn't exist yet, so the whole idea sat on paper for almost 25 years, waiting for the technology to catch up. Then, on a New York street in 1973, a Motorola engineer named Martin Cooper did something no one had ever done. He stood on the sidewalk, pulled out a phone with no wires at all, and made the first handheld cell phone call. He used it to call his rival at a competing company, just to tell him he'd done it first. The phone he was holding weighed about 2.5 pounds. People called it the brick, and they meant it literally. 10 years later, in 1983, you could finally buy one. The Motorola DynaTAC cost $3,995. That's close to $12,000 in today's money. It gave you 30 minutes of talk time and then needed 10 hours to recharge. And people lined up anyway. These first phones were analog. Your voice traveled through the air as a raw radio signal, an exact copy of the sound. Which meant anyone with a cheap radio scanner could tune to your frequency and listen to your private calls like a radio station. The technology worked, but it was crowded, and it was wide open. The fix came from turning your voice into numbers. In the early 1990s, a new generation of phones stopped sending sound and started sending code. Your voice chopped into ones and zeros. This is digital. It could be encrypted, so eavesdroppers heard only noise, and it packed far more callers into the same space. And going digital had a side effect nobody planned for. Once a phone could send data, Engineers realized it could send tiny bits of text between calls. In 1992, a young engineer typed 2 words into a computer and sent them to a phone across the network. The words were, "Merry Christmas." It was the first text message ever sent. There was one odd rule. A single text could only be 160 characters long. Why that number? An engineer named Friedhelm Hillebrand had sat at his typewriter, written out dozens of random sentences and questions, and found that almost all of them fit inside 160 characters. He essentially guessed, and that guess still shapes how you type today. Now the race was to shrink. 2 inventions made it possible. First, a new kind of battery, the lithium-ion cell, first sold in 1991, held far more power and far less weight. Second, engineers learned to pack an entire radio and a computer onto a single sliver of silicon. The brick became a bar. The bar fit in a palm. By the year 2000, a phone could vanish into your pocket. But it was still, mostly, a phone. The next leap turned it into something else entirely. In 2001, networks learned to carry real data at speed, and the phone quietly became a tiny piece of the internet. And then, in 2007, the last wall fell. The touchscreen. The trick was a technology called capacitive touch. Your body carries a faint electrical charge. The screen is coated with an invisible grid of conductors, and when your fingertip gets close, it distorts that tiny electric field, and the phone calculates exactly where you touched. It wasn't sensing pressure, it was sensing you. The keyboard disappeared, and the entire front of the phone became whatever the software wanted it to be. After that, the floodgates opened, and device after device dissolved into the glass. Your camera became a sensor the size of a fingernail. Your sense of direction became a chip listening to satellites 12,000 miles overhead, each one broadcasting the time so precisely that your phone can find itself on Earth to within a few feet. A compass, a map, a music player, a flashlight, a television. All of it, gone, absorbed into one slab. And that's the quiet miracle in your pocket. It isn't one invention, it's a stack of them, 70 years deep. Invisible honeycomb cells dividing the world. A handoff passing you tower to tower as you walk. Your voice frozen into numbers. A screen that feels your own electricity. The trunk of that 1946 car has followed you your entire life, shrinking year after year until it disappeared into a candy bar of glass you barely think about. And most people holding one have no idea any of it is in there. So here's my question for you. Of everything we just walked through, which invention mattered most? The cell that started it all, the touchscreen that reshaped it, or the battery that finally set it free? I think the real answer is the one almost nobody names. Tell me yours in the comments, and tell me if you think I'm wrong. We get curious about the stuff nobody thinks to ask. Subscribe and feed your idle curiosity.